Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am a part of the Gestalt IT community. And each episode, we try to bring you the perspectives of IT luminaries on a variety of technical subjects. And instead of just kind of talking off the cuff, we pick a topic or a premise, if you will, and we try to stay on that premise as much as possible. I'd like to take a moment for our guests this week to introduce themselves before we jump into the premise for today's episode, starting with Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Puluka. I'm a network architect for DQE Communications, a service provider in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And you can follow me at my website, puluka.com, or LinkedIn and Twitter.
All right. Chris?
Good morning. I'm Chris Hayner. Until very recently, I was head of pre-sales and solutions at a Philadelphia area consulting company called Anexinet. At the moment, more of a free agent, and I am available on Twitter at Hayner80 and online at Hayner.net.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise of today's episode. Now, in 2021, it was no secret that ransomware was one of the biggest security threats that we faced. It wasn't more than a week that went by before we saw some big headline about a company that was hacked or that there was some ransom that needed to be paid. And over the course of the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, we've seen some very high-profile cases, whether they were the Colonial Pipeline or JBS Meats, or even Garmin, which was forced to pay ransom to the Lazarus Group with the permission of the U.S. Treasury Department. However, it's 2022, and things have changed a little bit. And it's my prediction, as the premise of this episode, that in 2022, we are going to see this wave of ransomware attacks dissipate significantly. So in the pre-show, we were talking a little bit about some of the factors that go into the ransomware environment, the landscape, if you will. And I think it may be a good idea to kind of level set for people at home to understand that ransomware is not an organized thing. While there are crews that are organized, by and large, this feels a lot like disorganized crime, if you will. I want to open up the floor a little bit. Steve, you've kind of kept up with some of these things in the news. What are some of the ways that ransomware crews operate that maybe people aren't immediately aware of if they only get their news from regular news outlets like CNN and maybe aren't into the IT space?
Well, I would say most of the ransomware crews are falling into a couple of categories. The ones that are financially motivated are groups of people that work together and actually run very much like a small company, and they're targeting particular companies, or they're using even services that are providing infrastructure for them that they buy. So you might be a specialist where you provide just one part of the service, the exploit or the actual compromised devices, or the doing the ransomware portion itself, or even running the portals that things are running to. So it's very much like an industry group. But this other group is those that do it professionally for governments, for the purposes of intelligence gathering, stealing information, and just making life miserable for people you don't like across the globe.
Yeah, I think that that's an important distinction that we need to draw simply because when we think back to the 90s, when people were defacing websites to gain street cred, it was very much, script kiddies, the kinds of joyful little acts of anarchism that we saw in movies like the seminal Hackers with Johnny Lee Miller and Angelina Jolie. But realistically speaking, now it's become a business, honestly, kind of like sneakers, where you had, professionals that were doing penetration testings, only this time it's the bad guys doing this to make a buck. And as you said, it was actually kind of amusing that, in recent news, because of some of the geopolitical turmoil between Russia and Ukraine, we actually saw a Ukrainian member of the Conti ransomware group dump some of their internal files to security researchers. And one of the things that struck me as kind of funny in that whole dump, not just the way that they operate, but the fact that they actually do treat it like a business, like their agents, if you want to call them that, put in requests for time off and take vacations and need people to cover their job. I'm like, on my side, I need somebody to cover any service calls that come in for this router while I'm on vacation. And for them, it's like, hey, I need somebody to make sure that this bot's still running inside this network while I'm, on the coast or something. And I just thought that was kind of amusing that it's so pedestrian for them now that, it's not like you see in the movies where it's like, like the table scene in Untouchables, where Al Capone is like, leading his crew and it's all, rough and tumble. No, they basically treat it like it's any other day at Enron or AIG or something like that. Chris, what's your perspective on the way that this kind of stuff operates? I mean, visibility into the way that ransomware crews work. Do people have this the correct assumption that they're all just criminals that are trying to extort people, and all they were doing is getting into it for the money?
Well, I think it's important to note that there still are the opportunistic, the script kiddies, the spray and pray type of attacks. They've never stopped. They still exist as a one off here, there, and everywhere. And it really depends when you talk about those crews, it depends on what their goal is. And that's one of the things that has really helped ransomware, put help in air quotes here, helped it have with 2021 was ransomware's best year ever. What do they want to get out of it? Is it in the spray and pray? The defacement of the websites is one thing. Uh, get in, encrypt all of website X's files for a quick buck is another. And then, when you're talking about the state level actors who are actually trying to go in and work behind the scenes for months and months, modifying a file here, tweaking a file there, the solar winds type of attacks that will then perpetrate across so many other different industries and different companies that they would never have access to before. That level of sophistication is, I think, what you're talking about when it comes to these types of crews and these types of government level entities.
That is a very important distinction to draw, because I think it's something important that the news media does not do a good enough job of explaining. There's ransomware. There are tools and programs that are designed to pop up on your system and tell you that they've locked all of your equipment and that you need to pay a certain number of Bitcoin to have them unlocked, or to get the keys to prevent the future infection or what have you. And then there's the deeper kind of threats, and the SolarWinds exploit would probably be the biggest example of this, where a crew got into the SolarWinds development platform and inserted rogue DLL files into the builds, not because they wanted to steal money and force SolarWinds to pay them, but they wanted backdoors into other companies. They wanted to be able to pull secret information out of there, and let's be fair, they were pretty successful. But I think that one of the things that maybe typifies this is ransomware is very visible. It wants you to pay. It wants you to know that you've gotten infected. These other crews that are doing it, whether it's for intelligence gathering purposes or corporate espionage or something like that, they would prefer to never be found. The only reason that they were found out with this whole SolarWinds hack was because FireEye and Mandiant started investigating it, and then FireEye and Mandiant got infected. And of course, when you infect the security researchers, they're going to tear the whole thing apart and find out what happened. And that's when we started seeing the information rolling up. And now all of a sudden, I think it was Fancy Bear was the crew that did that. They're exposed and having to deal with it. In fact, I believe they ended up going to ground over it because they got caught. So, maybe the one of the things is that ransomware has become a little too visible. Because we did see that in 2021. The crew that infected the Colonial Pipeline immediately backed off and said, we didn't mean to do that, and please don't run us out of business. And then they just disappeared. The Kaseya hack, which was probably the biggest one by terms of likelihood of causing real massive problems, was done by Revil, a gang that, well, from all accounts, pretty much signed their own warrant as soon as they did it, because Kaseya got hacked. It was a pretty ingenious hack, I must admit, using Windows Defender to deliver the payloads. But they hacked a whole bunch of people that were using Kaseya. The FBI got involved and said, don't pay the ransom. And then it comes out later that the FBI had already invaded Revil's servers, had the keys to decrypt all the information, and they were basically just collecting evidence to be able to prosecute these folks. And then they got the Bitcoin wallets that all of the ransom was delivered to, and basically took it all back. And it ended up being that Revil ended up having to go to ground again. And we saw news in just the recent month or so, maybe 2 months ago, that the Revil gang, there were starting to be some very high profile arrests in Eastern Europe and Russia, because essentially they kind of got too popular. They became the biggest target on the block, if you will. So could that be something that would be causing ransomware infections to kind of dissipate, is the crews are becoming way too visible and being forced to kind of hit their big score and then disappear so that they don't get caught and arrested?
Well, it's not just that. I think also when you talk about a SolarWinds type attack or a Kaseya type attack, once one disclosure comes out, all the other disclosures have to come out because everybody knows that this was a large scale effort. And like you're saying, a lot of security researchers will be aware. Kaseya hit 12 different companies, and here they all are. Where in a regular, let's call it 2017, those companies would never put that out. They don't want the public to know about it. They don't want to be embarrassed by the fact that they got hit by ransomware. When you talk about large scale attacks like this, I feel like sometimes the publicity is forced, whereas previously they would never ever want this to make it to the front page of the New York Times.
I think there's two things: one for the financial side, and one for the intelligence side. On the financial side, there's been a lot of pressure on in, insurance companies and the reclamations that you just spoke about. Because the blockchain actually is a recorded blockchain, and in order to hide it, you just have to do tons and tons of transactions. They've now shown that they can reverse these and find this and recover this money. So that reduces the financial motivation, and of course the possibility of arrest as a result of that is there too. And likewise, insurance companies are less willing than they have been in the past to pay these things. So therefore, it's reducing the financial side for those financially motivated. On the intelligence side, we have to remember that the reason you do ransomware on the intelligence side is not to ever give them the key. It's really a wiper. You're coming in here, you found what you wanted, you exfiltrated it, and you give the big middle finger to to the people by locking everything down and pretending to be a ransomware crew, but you have no intention of ever giving them a key. They're just plain in trouble. And that has now proved to be not as effective in the intelligence space. So they're moving back to the more normal thing you just mentioned, where I don't want to be known. I don't want that visibility at the end of the day in the intelligence operation. I just want to silently gather what I need and maintain a permanent long-term presence. So for
Yeah.
both those reasons, I think the dissipation is going to be occurring this year.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and that's actually kind of an interesting thing, because there are crews out there that are 100% financially motivated. Lazarus Group out of North Korea is one of the ones that comes to mind. They are literally doing what they do to get money for reasons, because North Korea is effectively cut off from the rest of the world financial markets. So they kind of have to, I guess, almost treat it like a business. Like they only go after targets that they know are going to pay or that can be forced to pay. Garmin is a good example. Garmin had to pay because their entire system got locked down, and because of the amount of critical infrastructure they operate, they had to. And remember that Lazarus is on a Treasury watch list. You have to get explicit permission from the U.S. Treasury Department to pay them a cent. So they went after people they know were going to pay. Well, then, as you mentioned with the insurance company thing, insurance companies were paying up before because they're like, you know what, you have an insurance policy with us. But just like a regular insurance company for home or auto or life, we're getting to the point where they're paying out so much. They're like, wait a minute, hold on. You've got to take some reasonable precautions. You cannot take out a life insurance policy and then suddenly decide to take up, I don't know, like skydiving or free diving or trying to launch yourself into space on a homemade rocket. Like you have to take reasonable precautions. And that's where that second group comes into play, I think, is some of the crews that we've seen that have been attributed to Eastern European organizations in the past, where they would love to get paid. But if they don't get paid, they don't care, because their secondary goal is to create chaos. So they'll launch a wiper, or they'll just never, even if you pay up, they'll never give you the key, because ultimately the goal is get a little bit of money. But if we can cause a little trouble on the way out, that kind of, suits the goals of the people who watch over us, if you will. And then on the other polar end of the spectrum, like you said, is the intelligence gathering organizations, which is starting to come down to a lot of people who are attributed to being out of China, where what they want to do is they want to get information. What they do with it afterwards, they don't care. They just want to get the data. And then they don't want to get caught. They don't want to get seen. And it kind of progressively, where do they fall on that spectrum? Are they wanting to get paid? Are they wanting to cause chaos? Or are they wanting to get something else and not get noticed? And I think that part of, as we mentioned, is that as the rise of the people who do the intelligence work is starting to become more important for geopolitical instability, by default, the amount of ransomware infections is going to visibly decrease. Not because there's not as many people getting infected, they're just not so sure about it anymore. Because, the long-term compromises that are designed to slowly collect data in a trickle as opposed to getting paid are the kinds of things that, maybe it gets infected in 2022, but we may not find out about it until the end of 2023. So when does the attribution happen?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the solar winds made a splash, but it was 6 months in the making before it actually came up on front pages. I think you hit on something really important that is going to help companies pivot and protect themselves in a better way. And that is, if they have a mandate from an insurance company, you have to do better or you will get $0, they're going to do better. One of the big things that a lot of these attacks expose is that people have been very, very focused on the edge, on protecting from the outside in, and had little to no protection or understanding or auditing of what's going on east west inside of your environment. And that's what would happen in these types of attacks. A trusted thing comes into your environment, a SolarWinds agent. Then that malware is inside your perimeter and it can move around at will if there's no auditing, if there's no protection of data, if there's no expectation that user X should not be looking at data store Y. They can keep poking at it until they get it. That kind of thing is going to change, I think, within the next year for a lot of companies. They're going to pay more attention to things like zero trust and really care and audit. What are the agents? What are the devices? What are the programs that are trying to talk to my data and why? And those are
Yeah,
not those are not questions that people can answer right now.
you're right. And that's one of the biggest problems that we've seen, especially in the security space, is that this traditional idea that we've had for years that there needs to be a hard, crunchy perimeter to protect the soft stuff inside is effectively dead. Like, anybody who still believes that perimeter security is the only thing to focus on probably needs to retire, because you're about that age. But between all of the things we've seen, like zero trust network architectures and public cloud assets, I mean, you can't have a crunchy edge in the cloud because you have to go through the crunchy edge to get to the stuff you want. It's starting to change the way that we look at things, and I think that you're very accurate when you say that a lot of the traditional threat vectors have changed, but it's the behavior of the attackers when they get inside the system that really has stayed the same. Lateral movement, reconnaissance, footprinting, trying to get a foothold in the network so that you don't get kicked out. And that's where the efforts have really been kind of focused in things like ZTNA, is you're trying to prevent people from getting that foothold and moving around. And so, because prey distinguishes itself through movement, if they're moving, you see them. It's when they're standing still that you don't. And ZTNA keeps them from moving very far. They're just going to sit there and run in circles. And so, I think that that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind, is that with new architectures that come online, we have the ability to kind of limit the impact of ransomware. Now, I'll be the first person to tell you that, just buying a product is not going to fix your problems. You have to have a policy in place, and you have to enforce it, and you have to make sure there are no exceptions to the policy, because guess whose machine's probably going to get compromised? Probably the CEO's machine, who doesn't have those restrictions because I need to be able to do this and you need to
Right.
fix this because I'm the one in charge.
Yeah, I mean, we've been chasing for a decade now, trying to do zero trust, and I think we're on our third or fourth label for it. But it's not simple to do, and I think the more recent trend that may be even more effective is to monitor what's happening. And we've proven, I think, we're having a hard time locking things down hard, because you have to know too much, and quite frankly most of the teams don't know what the normal communications are, and it's not easy for them to get them. So locking down a ZTNA is not a trivial task. But what has risen in more recent years is through the use of canaries and other monitoring softwares to be able to detect changes or anomalies, or having these canary traps that trigger then when someone's in here exploring your network. Those have been far more effective in preventing the lateral movement these ransomware crews rely on in order to be able to exploit the systems.
It's actually a really interesting point because I think this is one of the things that challenges me so much about ransomware today. We're not working in the dark. We're not working in the old days where we had a firewall, or maybe if we were lucky, we had an IDS. We have so many other tools now that we can use to implement in a network that prevent these problems. And not just that, but for once the tools are talking to each other. We don't have a massive silo problem like we did, in the early 2000s, where this is my data and you can't ever look at it because if you look at it, then I don't have a job. Like everything's being fed into a SIM or a SOAR. We have architectures. Are we still on XDR? Have we moved off of that? Are we on to the next thing? Like how is it that we're still seeing these same kinds of behaviors when we know so much more about it? Is it that we're just catching it earlier, or is it just that they become that much more sophisticated?
Well, I think it's the two-sided coin thing here, where the detection piece has grown by leaps and bounds in capabilities. Where previously, for the last 30 years, we've been mostly focusing on prevention, which is sort of the hamster wheel, you know, of trying to plug all the holes. And that's how the security business, we became known as the Department of No, because we were always blocking things, and it's like, oh, open it up, open it up, open it up, because nobody actually knew how they communicated to each other, and you would accidentally block legitimate things. But the detection space has ballooned and done so well in the last several years that it's been able to, okay, maybe we can't prevent it, but at least we see it very shortly after it happens.
Yeah, and really that's the goal, is how quickly do we figure this stuff out? Do we figure out that we got hacked 2 months ago and now we have to go back to backups? Or do we figure it out 45 minutes into an attack and we can stop it before any exfiltration at all is even possible, let alone has happened?
There's a
When
big
it comes
ground
to
in
the things
between
that
those two.
one other thing, I just want to touch on something that Steve said in passing around security in general and zero trust in particular, is that it's not easy. And not only is it not easy, in a lot of cases, getting it to operate is not fun. Buying something is fun. Getting it to work 100% and appropriately is not fun. When you talk about the tools that are out on the market, we are awash in tools. But tools is not what solves security problems. It's policy, procedure, enforcement, and auditing, which I just said 4 words and half the audience fell asleep. That's just the way that these things work. It's fun to buy a new IAM tool. It's fun to buy a new SIM. But then you have to put it together. You have to connect it. You have to make sure that it maps to various policies, procedures, especially if you're in a regulated industry. These things have to work and you have to prove it. And it's really, I find a lot of people just run the risk of, buying 12 tools and saying we're good, and then not recognizing that the policy procedures aren't being followed. There are gaps that they don't know about, and they only are exposed to those gaps when it's too late.
The Target hack was the perfect example of that from decades ago, where they had all the fancy tools they were triggering, and it's like, oh, there's too many alarms, let's tune them down. And then like a year later, they found out they were hacked.
Yeah, I mean, you mean this pile of stuff that I got sold by my reseller is not the solution to my problems? The box says security on it. Like that's
Yeah.
everything I need.
I didn't want to take it out of the box. It looks good on the shelf.
Or worse yet, today they generate pretty pictures, reports that make you feel good.
I'm sure this time next year they'll sell an NFT for it.
But ultimately, isn't that the problem? Is that a lot of what we deal with in security is the unknown. Like, we're trying to find out what's going on, and everybody is not vulnerable until they are. And usually, when you are, it's not because you just got hacked; it's because you've been hacked and you've been dealing with it for a while. And maybe that's the nice thing about ransomware, is that it ultimately has told us immediately that you've been hacked, as opposed to it being persistent in your network for months or years. And in the business model of pay me and I'll go away versus I want to hide out for a while and do what I can to steal stuff, has changed our perception of the way that security needs to be done. Whereas before, we just wanted to be able to limit the risk and liability if we ended up getting hacked. Whereas ransomware, now there's such a short dwell time between infection and problems that we want to try to close that gap as much as possible. So could it be that the rise of ransomware, like Chris said, 2021 was a banner year for them. The rise of the popularity of using ransomware to get money is what will eventually lead to their downfall, because our defenses will adapt to specifically address that problem.
Yeah, and I think they're going to address them from a perspective of zero trust. And by that, I mean the default answer to any question about access is going to be no. A lot of the times, the way that you get for these types of attacks to work is some type of novel way to get from system A to system B. And if you have rigorous security in place that keeps track of all of those types of things, even ones we have not considered or defined yet, if it's not defined, the answer is no. That's going to make it a lot harder for new ransomware. It's not going to make it impossible, but it's going to make it a lot harder for them to have the kind of unfettered access that they have in a lot of environments now.
I think you're probably right there. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah. I think that's part of your point that they tell us they're there is was the big change when ransomware came on the scene. Most of the hacks are about stealing things and being stealthy and staying as long as you can, and so therefore you didn't want to know they were there. But the whole point of ransomware is to announce yourself at the end of the day. So and it was all ransomware was all about quick buck too. I can get in, I can get my money and leave. I don't have to collect tons and tons of things that I sell later on a resale market. But because it has these big payments up front, and because they've had this big impact last year, they are being cracked down on. So as a result of that, people are circling the wagons, doing a better job detecting these earlier, kicking people out, and hopefully we're going to see it rise to an acceptable level of infection, because I don't think it'll ever completely go away.
All right. I think that the ultimate answer to the premise is that yes, ransomware is going to dissipate in 2022, but maybe not because we're fixing the problem. I think that we're doing a lot of great work in addressing the unique challenges that we're seeing in the ransomware space. I think that we're ultimately rising to the occasion, but more importantly, the way that we're combating it is causing the people doing it to kind of have to run away for fear that they're going to get caught. Now, without deeping too deeply into the current geopolitical climate as of the recording of this podcast, there's a lot of things that are working against crews that have been operating out of Eastern Europe and Russia for a number of years. And, being unable to gain access to the world financial markets does put a damper on your ability to collect payments from people. Does that mean that the pendulum is going to swiftly shift back to more intelligence gathering, or maybe being located away from these areas? I don't have an answer for that. And unfortunately, because of the nature of things not being ransomware focused, we may not know for months or even years how pervasive those threats get. But as we mentioned here, the key for you to be able to dissipate ransomware infection probability in your environment is to have good policies, good procedures, educate your people, and have reasonable solutions to help you fix that problem. Not crazy, reasonable. If you can put all of those things together, you're going to have not only a security posture that prevents ransomware infections, but prevents a lot of other security problems that you might have in the future. Because as it turns out that no matter how much the technology advances, no matter how crafty the attackers get, having good, basic, sound security principles is a solution for almost every problem. That will just about do it for this episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you would like to subscribe to our podcast, if you're not already, just make sure to search for On-Premise IT Roundtable in your favorite podcast application of choice. You can always check out the latest episode on our website at gestaltit.com/podcast. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the security offerings from a number of companies in the industry, you can check out our Security Field Day 7 event, which will be taking place March 23rd through the 25th. Just head over to techfieldday.com and look for Security Field Day 7, and you can catch up on all of the great info from that event. We will be back with you very soon with another episode on another amazing premise. I would like to thank our guests for being a part of this podcast, and I'd like to thank each and every one of our community members for tuning in. We will catch you soon.